I really wish you would have said a below average Al-Anon speaker. Hello everyone. Somebody asked me a few minutes ago if I was nervous, and at the time I wasn't, and I said no, but now I am. So they say once you say that then you're going to be better. And I'm imagining every one of you naked right now. They also say that there's three stories. Every time you speak, there's three stories. There are the ones, it's the one you want to tell, the one you tell, and then the one you beat yourself up over for 3 days afterwards. So hopefully I don't have to beat myself up too much. But yeah, I'm probably not your picture of a recovering codependent. But I grew up on a farm in Nebraska. It was a corn farm, 160 acres, right on the Platte River. If you don't know the Platte, it's really wide and really shallow, and in the summer it pretty much dries up. So it was fantastic for like exploring and motorcycle riding, and in the winter we had all kinds of waterfowl and hunting and all that. And it was also a lot of work, and the winters were nasty. And I'm the third of 4 children. I've got an older brother who's 10 years older, a sister who's 7 years older, and a 2-year younger brother. And it was, some of my earliest memories are laying in the grass by the farmhouse, looking up in the sky, wondering why I was here, right? So my earliest memories are of existential crisis. And it was because I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't know why I was here because my dad was working all the time. So my image of my dad, our farm was really small and really only made enough money to pay for the taxes and the mortgage. So my dad was always working 2 or 3 jobs. So that's what I remember of my dad. He was gone, or I would see his back. And my mom was basically a martyr and a workaholic, so I'll get back to the martyrdom in a little bit in the story. But that's what I remember of her also, is seeing her back in the kitchen, her back in the basement canning, her back in the, seeing her back in the garden. And so it's like, aren't really paying attention, of me. Why am I here? And also, my mom was, she had a temper for sure. So, my little brother and I would always wonder, like, why are we in trouble? For just trying to have some attention or whatever. I later found out that when I learned that addiction is a family disease, and they talk about that there's the addict, there's the enabler, and then often the children are in the roles of hero and scapegoat and lost child and mascot. That was our family. My mom was the addict. My dad was the enabler. My oldest brother was the hero. My sister was the scapegoat. I was a lost child. And my youngest brother, he was the clown of the family. So while my parents weren't, I don't have any horror stories about them, beating us or beating each other or whatever, but there was, and I didn't see this for a long time, but there was some serious drinking going on. It was German farmers, and everybody drank like fish. When I think back so there was about 5 families on this farm road that our farm was off of, and you could drive down the roads, and the ditches were full of beer cans. And this is just from a few families. You could find beer cans in the cornfields because they'd had a cooler and were drinking on the combines and on the tractors as they were farming. After work, the weekends, that's what I remember growing up, was playing horseshoe with my little brother behind the bars in the little farm towns. So that's basically, what that was. I remember even when I was growing up and going into high school, that my parents were like, "Hey, did you have any parties this weekend?" We weren't hiding anything from my little brother and I. We were throwing these massive parties. My parents were like really proud of us for throwing these big beer parties and stuff. So it was definitely out in the open. So anyway, grew up that way. Even went to a 2-room schoolhouse through 2nd grade. I had one other kid in my class. And when I was young, it was exciting to go to church on Sundays because that's when I would actually meet other kids. And before I was in kindergarten, I was always looking forward to going to church and Sunday school because there was this girl named Kelly. And jet black hair, jet black eyes. I was falling for her even as a little kid. And so I always looked forward, going through second grade, going to church to see Kelly. Well, they decided to close their little school down, and so we had to go to town for school. And guess who was in my class? Kelly. And so I was so happy. So third grade through sixth grade, it was like, and they went to the same church, so my parents and their parents would often get together and do things, and it was awesome, right? So she was my girl. And I even remember I was 12 years old. My sister got married. She got pregnant in high school and got married, and I was with my older brother and his wife, and we were driving back to the farm after the wedding. I was 12, and my sister-in-law asked, "So you're next, right? And you're gonna get married someday?" And I'm like, "Yeah, Kelly, right?" I mean, it was like, this is it, right? So we get into grade school or junior high, and by this time I'm in 8th grade, and on a farm, and my birthday's early, it's in October, so my birthday was right after when school started. And when you're on a farm, you can get a driver's license when you're 15. And I was already working, so I had money, and I had saved up, and I had a motorcycle, and I actually had a car. But I remember Kelly came to me, and she said, and plus not only then my beard came in early, I had long hair, I wore my brother's old leather jacket. People literally thought I was 27 when I was 15. So you can do the math, you know where this is going, right? So anyway, Kelly comes to me, she said, there's a senior in high school I want to go out with. And I was just like, what? And I'm like, well, you know what he wants, right? Anyway, so Kelly ended up breaking up, and I was shocked. And so by this time, I had a car, I had money, and I looked like I was 27. And I don't remember much of those years after that. And it was actually easier in 8th grade and 9th grade to be crazy and skip school because nobody suspected it, right? What's a 14 or 15, 16-year-old kid gonna do, And of course, it wasn't long before the seniors in high school figured out that I could buy anything, anywhere. So by the time I was 15, 16, and I worked in a motorcycle shop and a boat shop, so I made pretty good money. So by that time in my life, it was party time, right? So the weekends were, let's go find Kurt, because he's got a keg, and that's where the party is, right? But what I didn't realize was my codependency was coming out then because I was the one buying the kegs, right? So it wasn't about me buying the kegs to get drunk, right? Or, buying weed or whatever it was I was buying. It was really about, creating that social situation where I could be comfortable. Because before that, I was, on the farm, there was a lot of isolation. I was really curious. Again, I had this existential crisis, right? I was really curious about things. And also another thing that kind of happened that was big was I was totally into science. This was the time of the space, Apollo missions and all that. And I was into all that and rocketry and all this stuff. I mean, I was a total nerd. And so in 8th grade, I built this big rocket. And I talked the science instructor to let me bring this rocket to junior high and shoot it off, right? And so I bring all this stuff and I set it all up and I shoot this thing off, and it's a windy day, so it goes up, and I had it aimed just right where it comes right back down, and I'm just like, this is fantastic. And I remember looking around, and everybody was like, and it hit me, holy crap, nobody cares, right? Nobody cared. So, so growing up on the farm, things like that, interests I had that other people didn't have. My girlfriend, is off, right? So I'm off to the races, right? So I have no idea how many kegs I bought in high school, and even into college, but I bought a lot of them, that's for sure. And so that's often when I tell people I tried really hard to be a drug addict or an alcoholic, but I was too much of a codependent, I think. So anyways, even through high school and stuff, and even so that was kind of the thing, was being in with the partiers, but just really trying to fit in, because I didn't really feel like I fit in. And that was even a period where the masks started coming out. There was the good son mask, and the good student mask, and the partier mask, and the working Kurten mask, right? Because I wasn't comfortable. I didn't know how to fit in. I didn't know how to have relationships. So that's what that period of my life really was around that. So, dated, of course, in high school and in college and had a lot of fun with that. It was all pretty superficial. And then I met this woman. She was actually a friend of a roommate that had come into town. And the first time when she came to visit him he was from Indiana, she came to visit him. They had been broken up a long time. She just came down to visit. I had heard about her. And then she came back a second time, and I just saw her a couple of times. And she went back to where she was from, right back to Indiana. And I get a letter from her a couple weeks later, maybe a month later. And it was like, I was really impressed by you, and I showed this to my roommate, and I'm like, this is weird, I don't want anything to do with this. And he's like, man, stay away from her, she's trouble. So, cards keep coming, letters are coming, she calls, I'm like, look, I don't want to in the middle of this. And so it kind of quiets down for a little while. And my roommate moves out, I move, he actually moves to Hawaii, and some time goes by, I'm not dating, she calls. And I'm like, man, she's really interested. And she was good looking and a lot of fun. One of the stories is that and I was going back to school at the time, so I didn't have a lot of money, so she flew me up to Indianapolis to see her. So I got off the plane at the airport, and that's back in the day when you didn't have to go through security and you could just walk down and meet the people coming off the plane, right? So I get off the plane, she's not there. So I walk out and I get my luggage, and I hear over the intercom, Kurt, there's a call for you, and I pick up the phone, and it's like, hey, this is the limo driver, this woman's working, your girlfriend's working, and she sent me to pick you up. So I go out, and here's this big limo, and I'm like, wow. And I get in the back, and she's in the back. And I'm like, what are you doing here? And she opens her coat, and she's butt naked, and she's got a bottle of champagne. I'm like, this is going to work. We had pretty much fun then. Actually, it was interesting because that whole night, that's all she had on was that coat and that, nothing else. And we went to a lot of bars that night. So I'm like, man, this is fun, right? But I didn't know what I was getting into. So it all went really good, and we ended up getting married. And she got pregnant right away, said she was on birth control. But to my surprise, after a couple months after we were married, we were pregnant with our first son. And we were both working at the time, but I started a business, and I had some investors, and they said, look, we want you totally focused on this business, so we're going to compensate you enough where your wife doesn't have to work. She was all in, right? Oh, I don't have to work? Fine with me. Well, I found out that the reason for that was that the drinking could start. So, my drinking was dropping off. I mean, I definitely had my party days, but my drinking was dropping off. Hers was increasing. A couple of years later, she's pregnant again, and it was a little girl that we lost. It was a premature birth at about 4.5 months, and it really affected us both for sure, and the drinking got worse. And then a couple years later, she's pregnant with now my youngest son, and because the baby doctor said, hey, you've got high-risk pregnancies, we're going to put you in bed. And I still had my business at that time and I could work from home. So she was in bed for about 4.5 months. Well, that's when the pattern started of Kurt, right? Oh, by the way, I forgot. Welcome to my town, Kurten. Appreciate Maurice for that. That's when it started where, okay, now Kurt is the grocery shopper, the house cleaner, the baby caretaker, everything, right? So the pattern was set. And so after she gave birth to my now youngest son, the drinking stepped up again. And finally it got to a point where I couldn't take it anymore, and I said, look, if this doesn't change, I'm out of here. And she said, I'll do better. We're living, I don't like the neighborhood we're living in, and it wasn't the nicest neighborhood, and I had made some money by that time. So, and I grew up by a lake, right? Later on, after we moved off the farm, we lived by a lake, and it was a lot of fun. So I was like, well, let's move up to Lake Conroe. And so sure enough, we moved up to Lake Conroe, lived on the lake, boat, jet ski, that kind of stuff, had a lot of fun. I enjoyed it with the kids. And things were better for a while, but of course, the drinking started again. And if you know the people that live on the lake, there was plenty of people to go drinking with. And so it just got worse, and it got worse and worse. So by early 2008, I just couldn't take this anymore. And so I ended up separating, and I said, look, if you're not going to go get help, then I'm not coming back. And she didn't. In the meantime, my youngest son was 8th grade by then, and before I had moved out, he had gotten in trouble because he had pot in his football locker at school. So he had been on probation, got through that, got off probation. But after I moved out, he got in trouble again for pot, and he was on probation, and he tested dirty for coke. So this escalated. So this was while the divorce was going on, right? And I was definitely pretty stressed out. Not only from what had been going on, but now this is even escalating. And then he ended up in juvenile drug court in Montgomery. And so I don't know if you know Judge Michael Mays. He was a pretty serious guy because I think he lost a daughter to drugs, but he was pretty intense. And he said, look, your son's a juvenile. I know what's going on with this separation and divorce. You're all getting help. So, first we put my oldest son in a rehab. And the first family day at the rehab was when I learned about the disease, the family disease of addiction. And they showed a big PowerPoint with the addict and the scapegoat, who was my son, and the hero, which is my youngest child. But the biggest picture on the page was the enabler. And that's the first time I went, oh my God, right? I am a huge part. I'm making this stuff happen. I am the gasoline that's going on the fire. So that was my first awakening into all of this. Didn't know about Al-Anon yet, but I had been going to counselors and things like that. We had been to marriage counselors, all the stuff, that a lot of you probably experienced too. But, and I was driving around listening to these, these like self-help books and stuff like that, just trying to find answers. And in one of the books I was listening to, the speaker was talking about the concept of original sin. And what he said is that original sin isn't that you're born bad. Sin comes from the word sans, which means without. He said what it really means is you're born without life skills. And it hit me like a lightning bolt. I remember the day, the time, the weather, where I was the first time I heard that, because it hit me so hard. And that was like, oh my God, I am living with no skill, right? My whole life, I'm trying to hold work together. I got all this crazy crap going on with my son. This divorce is going on. I don't trust anybody. It was like, this is not good. So Judge Mays said, I want you guys all going to 12-step meetings. So I was taking my son to NA meetings because he didn't have a driver's license yet. And that was like, wow, this is really good, right? I'm learning some things. I'm learning about addiction. And then one night, it's like Well, there's this Al-Anon meeting next door at the Conroe Club. I'm going to go check that out. Dana's smiling. She remembers. And I went in there and I heard the promises. Didn't have any. And they read the Al-Anon do's and don'ts. And I went, I'm doing all the don'ts and I'm not doing any of the do's. This is where I need to be. And so I was all in, right? Step one, my life was unmanageable. I was there, right? Step one, check mark. But step two was challenging for me because I'm an atheist. And it's like, okay, what higher power? There's nothing in my life that's helping me. What higher power is going to restore me to sanity? And that was a big challenge. But finally, it's like, I figured out that it didn't have to be some, deity, right? And it's like, Al-Anon, that's workable for me, right? I know that there's a lot of experience here, and they can help me, and my Al-Anon group for now can be my higher power. So step two, finally, it took probably a year. But then step three was I had to turn my will and my life over to this group of old ladies. So I had to do some work with that too. But they loved me, so they were kind and gentle, and it was all good. So that's kind of where it started, and working through the steps, it took a while for me to find a sponsor, because that's one of the challenges for men in Al-Anon. But came to find out that my biggest character defect, easy, is being a martyr. I think there's a lot of martyrs in Al-Anon. I've met a few for sure. And of course, looking back and seeing, I learned from the best, man. My mom was fantastic, right? I learned from the best. And so that's one of the themes you'll hear from what my experience is dealing with that. Understanding that there was so many things I did, right? So, I had this pattern like I'm still doing the shopping and the cooking and the cars and the bills and, mowing the lawn and all this stuff, but bitching the whole time that mama's in getting drunk or she's partying with the neighbors or whatever. It's like, can't she see I'm doing all this stuff, So that's where I started seeing, again, what am I bringing to the table? Bailing them out, right? She got a DUI. I bailed her out of that. I was paying for attorneys for my oldest son, bailing him out. I thought I was helping them, but I wasn't. And I also came to learn that all that I did was fear-based, right? That I was fearful of what was going to happen to them, that it wasn't going to turn out. So anyway, so that's kind of where things were early on, and finally the divorce is done. And so some of the do's and don'ts were find recreation and hobbies. So that's kind of what I started again, was just, my hobbies were my addicts, right? So breaking that pattern and starting to, focus on me and find things that were enjoyable and all that. So that's kind of how things early on were for me in Al-Anon. So I had those initial epiphanies, and towards the end, when my oldest son was still in drug court, he had gotten out of juvie, and we were separated. I was living in a house in Walden, and he was with me, and one morning I go out and I get in my truck, and I noticed that my seat was in a different position. So I come back in, hey son, did you take my truck last night? No, Dad, right? Okay. I go back out and I find this glass that wasn't mine in the truck. And I'm like, you took the truck. No, Dad, I know damn well you took the truck. Well, this is important because I lived in fear of Judge Mays. He would give us parents assignments. Study this book, go to these meetings, and if you didn't, he would hold you in contempt of court. And he'd put you in jail. So I'm going to this court every 2 weeks. Almost every 2 weeks, he's dragging some parent off to jail for the weekend. I'm like, damn, And so So this is going on with my son. I know something's up, right? And before that, he had asked me, he said, Kurt, I want you to write a paper on how what you're doing negatively affects your son. So I do all this research and I write this paper and I'm really proud of it and I hand it in to him and he's like, you didn't get it. Try it again. So I redo it all and I hand it in. He said, you're still not getting it. He said, don't worry. Think about it. But I want you to do this again. So that was before this happened with my son. So I'm shaking in my boots, right? I'm like, oh my God, I'm in all this trouble. But I call up his supervising officer and I said, look, this is what happened. Come on out. So they came out, they grabbed Nick and they took him. Sure enough, they found drugs in his room. And I'm just waiting for the handcuffs to come on Dad, right? I know I'm in so much trouble. And the supervising officer comes down the stairs with the other cops, and he pats me on the back and he said, "Good job." And I'm like, "Oh my God." That was August 20th. And I remember that date because the next day, in One Day at a Time, I read this. If I believe that it is hopeless to expect any improvement in my life, I am doubting the power of God. If I believe I have reason for despair, I am confessing personal failure, for I do have the power to change myself, and nothing can prevent it but my own unwillingness. Never let me imagine that my satisfaction with life depends on what someone else may do. This is a thinking error I can get rid of in Al-Anon. I can learn to avail myself of the immense, inexhaustible power of God if I'm willing to be continually conscious of God's nearness. Today's reminder: I am not at the mercy of a cruel or capricious fate, for I have the power to determine what my life will be. I am not alone. I have the confidence and faith of all Al-Anon to support my efforts, as it is expressed by the loving concern and help of the friends in my group. I am not alone because God is with me whenever I make myself aware of Him. To be without hope is to deny the wonderful possibilities of the future. And the light went on, and I wrote that paper, and he loved it. Because I saw, right? Thank you. I saw that was a turning point for me and another epiphany that the things that I were doing to protect him were hurting him. And so anyway, he got through all of that, and he got out. I had been in Al-Anon for a year and a half. I started traveling quite a bit. Things were pretty good. So guess what I did? I quit going to Al-Anon meetings. And I call that the era of good feelings, right? And guess what happens after that? So through all the crap that I had been through, that my oldest son had been through, I thought my youngest son, this ain't gonna happen to him, right? Guess what happened? So he's probably 14, I would say. Telephone rings, Mr. Niffler, this is Montgomery County Sheriff, we have your son. We caught him and some buddies. They have recently used drug paraphernalia, and we can't find any drugs on them. They were trespassing, come get them. And by that time I'm hoping, it's like, man, I hope he gets in really big trouble. But they just slapped his wrist, and I'm like, but I told him, I said, next time I catch you, we're going into a program. If I catch you after that, you're going to rehab, and if I catch you after that, you're out. So he's like, yeah. So some time went by, and I caught him smoking pot in his bedroom. I had suspected it, and I caught him. So we started this program called Cornerstone, which is an alternative peer group for both parents and for kids struggling with drugs or cutting or sex, porno or whatever. And it was really good. I'm coming back in, and it's like all these parents that had been in this before, and I'm like, I've got Al-Anon and all that, and they're like, yeah, whatever, dude. And so when I come back in, I'm like, oh my God, I realized how far I had slipped, right? We want to fix ourselves. I wanted to be fixed as a codependent. And I realized that it was actually, that time I didn't go was actually good for me, because it made me realize that I'm sick, right? And I need recovery. And it's not for a period of time, right? This is something that helped me, and it's valuable, and I want to continue it. So there were some good things out of that. So that was actually a good experience. I started going back to Al-Anon meetings, got another sponsor who was working my steps again. And at that point in time, so my sponsor was like, he goes, why aren't you sponsoring anybody? I'm like, man, I'm fucked up, dude. He goes, no, man, you know this stuff. You've had breakthroughs. You need to go, let people know that you're going to sponsor. I'm like, okay. So when they go around the end of the meeting, who's willing to sponsor? And I'd raise my hand. I mean, this went on for like 4 or 5 months. I'm like, nobody wants me. Finally, somebody asked me to be their sponsor. And then another, and another, and another, and the floodgates opened. So to the point where, at first it's like, wow, I got to sponsor you, But before long, I'm like, you want to be one of my sponsees, huh? So I worked them pretty hard. I still work them pretty hard, but, they appreciate it. But also during that time, I was at an Al-Anon meeting, and a guy who's a double winner, as I'm sure you know what that means, right? Both AA and Al-Anon. And he talked about that he uses honesty, humility, and service as a yardstick for how he's doing. And I thought, I think I'm pretty honest. They say if you think you're humble, you're not, so I'm not going to try and measure myself on that. But I'm not being a service. And so that was kind of the next chapter of my Al-Anon experience, is really starting into service. Certainly having sponsees was a start. I was active in meetings. I started getting very involved in Cornerstone. Then later I got involved with the district. And so I love that movie Yes Man with Jim Carrey. I became Yes Man, right? If somebody says, hey, would you? It's like, don't finish the sentence. Answer is yes. Because it's my higher power, right? If it's coming at me, it's my higher power. So why wouldn't I say yes? And so there's been some fantastic experiences from that. And even, even speaking, right? I never say no. And it's, it's fantastic, because that's what I've met so many fantastic people who've grown from it. But through that, so one of the things that I talk about with people often, especially sponsees, is that there's a lot of grieving. I don't know from an AA side, but from an Al-Anon side, there's a lot of grieving, right? There was something in my family that died, and what died was the Norman Rockwell painting that I thought my life and my family would be. And as the reality got different from that picture, the crazier I got. And it comes to the point, so that's, they say the stages of grieving are denial, anger, negotiation, depression, and acceptance. So I had a long period of denial, right? And so during the divorce and the drug court days and all that, had my period of anger. I was not happy about it. The days of good feelings, that was my negotiation period. I can deal with this. I'm fixed. Everything's okay. But when my youngest son was struggling with drugs and alcohol, the bottom dropped out. And that was my period of depression. And I was a mess, because it's like, man, this is, that was the realization that Norman Rockwell picture was never going to happen, right? But luckily, that is, and I now tell people this when they're sad about what's going on, it's like, that's great, because that means you're really close to acceptance. And so that's when things moved into, for me, to start to change. One of the key things, another epiphany that happened, was one of my sponsees just made an off-the-cuff comment. He said, Kurt, you must have had some issues in your childhood for you to be so closed. And it's like, closed? And I thought back, it's like, man, that never came up in working my steps. Nobody's ever really said that to me before. So I never saw it as an issue. I saw myself as pretty open. But I talked to some people that knew me well, and they're like, yeah, you can get pretty far with you, but not all the way. It's like, man, I need to work on that. So I started doing the work, and what I found out was that I wasn't trusting, right? Not because I feared people, but I didn't trust myself to be able to deal with those people in those situations. And I didn't have that trust, right, because I didn't trust my higher power, right? And I didn't trust my higher power because I didn't think my higher power was giving me what I needed. But what I had was all this evidence that I was. Like, for example, my son getting in trouble when he did with drug court, while it seemed like the worst thing that could possibly happen, it could not have been better. My ex-wife had to get help. They were drug testing her every week, right? I learned so much in that period. My son got help during that period. And so looking back, it's, I had overwhelming evidence that my higher power had my back, right? You can't get what you want, but you get what you need. I was getting what I needed. And so that's what I realized was, my higher power wasn't predictable, but had my back. So I can trust my higher power to be unpredictable, right? That was another epiphany for me, and really a breakthrough that started opening things up to kind of where I am now. And I talked earlier about fear, right? Being fear-driven. So I realized it was that lack of faith, right? Being an atheist, not having that faith, right? That made my life so ego-driven and so fearful. But, and that's kind of where I was during that period in my teens and 20s and 30s, was looking, right? I read all these books on, Hinduism and Zen and Kabbalah and all this stuff. I'm like, man, I'm shopping for religions. Couldn't find one. But, so I was always concerned about what I believed. And what I realized was it was blocking me. So once I let go of that, let go and let God, right? And realizing that fear is the opposite of faith, that things really started to kick into high gear for me. And so that's where I am these days. And for a while, so kind of going through the growth in my Al-Anon program, that was really the last couple of years, is seeing, one, how often I said I have to. Eating, sleeping, going to the bathroom, that's the only 3 things I have to do. Everything else I do is a choice. When I say I have to, I bring negativity to it, and that was just my character defect, being a martyr, right? So that's one thing I see now, is that things I do, if it's a choice, my attitude is about it is different. So that's one thing. Actually, a friend of mine came up with, I promised him I would share this. He says, MC equals NC. My choice equals no complaining. So that's one thing for me now, is that it changes my attitude when I say I decide to do this. How can I bitch about it if I decided? And if I did, I'm just being a martyr, right? So that's one thing. But also that fear is the opposite of faith. And I have overwhelming evidence that if I don't screw with stuff, life is pretty damn good. Right? So that's where I am these days, is really just that and really the spiritual awakening is that everything is happening exactly as it should if I don't mess with it. And man, life is really easy. It's amazing how much time on your hands when you're not trying to be somebody else's higher power, right? When you're not trying to screw with things. Or there's even some theory out these days, I forgot the name of it, but the theory is that if you push really hard on the fabric of the universe to be something you're not, it pushes back, right? Before I came in Al-Anon, I heard a saying, somebody said, you have 2 choices in life, you can accept your fate or you can be miserable, right? As long as I didn't accept my fate, I was miserable. I'm not miserable anymore because this is my life. My oldest son's in prison. That's his journey. My youngest son's doing fine for now. That's his journey. My ex-wife's on her journey. You all are on your own journey, right? And so accepting that, allows me to see everybody and myself, as they are. I saw this pastor. He said, when you come into 12-step, you've got yourself, your higher power, and your relationships, and they're separate. He said, when you really grow in recovery, those all to become together and become one. And so that's what I see happening. And anyway, it's fantastic. I'm so happy for this program. The reading was fantastic, and even somebody said before this, I think in the opening, that in the prayer, thank you God for my challenges. So thank you God for my challenges. I want to leave you with one thing that I saw as I was putting some notes down for this. So there's a term called a fideist, F-I-D-E-I-S-M. So fideism maintains that faith is independent of reason. In other words, and I've talked to other people about this too, is that belief can be a blocker for faith. If I'm trying to reason things out, it's a blocker. Reason and faith are hostile to each other. So let go and let God. Thank you.